I hope you get as excited as I do reading John's Gospel. Remember again, I told you every time you look at John, we need to look at numbers, places, things. This week we even got more of a treasure hunt. That's really what it is. That's why I get excited about it. Talk about treasure hunts. I was thinking about my cousin who just posted a picture of a coin from the 1600s. He lives in Virginia Beach area, and so he has a lot of old antiquities in the area. And he called a couple of years ago telling me he was getting into using his metal detectors, and he wanted to know if that would be work if he did that on Sunday. And I told him, I said, well, if you do it on Sunday as work, and you're going to make money, extra money, I said that would be work. But I said if you do it on Sunday out of pleasure, then give what you find to charity, and that would be a hobby. And so ever since then, guess what? He sends me check from time to time for what he's found on Sunday. So it pays off. Hopefully that 1630 coin was found on a Sunday too. We'll see what he does. Talking about treasure hunt today. Did you notice the numbers again in John's Gospel? The first one that really stood out for everyone, I'm sure, is 153. And it does for me too, because it's like that is not one of the super numbers that really has great significance. Matter of fact, there's discussion in terms of what does it really mean. And the best that I can find is that they suspect that 153 was the number of different languages supposedly in the world at that time, which would make a lot of sense then when you think of Jesus sending the apostles out to bring the good news to the whole world. And along with that, we see this net drawn in by all the apostles. And later on, you notice it was Peter himself alone that went back to finish dragging the net up to shore. It's like, wow. So John is telling us something. As a matter of fact, today's gospel is greatly about Peter. Greatly about Peter. What else do we find? One of the significant parentheses that John points out for us today, and probably most would just simply miss it, is something the apostles noticed from the boat as soon as they hit the shore. And that is that there was a charcoal fire that Jesus was fixing this fish on. Charcoal fire. That rings a bell for us. So we look at Peter, and of course Peter, most of all, it's going to say a great deal, just like our baptismal font back there, when those who come into the church now, they look at that and they say, wow, that's where I was baptized just at Easter. Well, for Peter, it's much that same thing, but maybe on a more negative note. He sees this charcoal fire, and you and I recognize that there's only one other place in all the New Testament where a charcoal fire is mentioned. And when is that? That was on Holy Thursday. That was the night before Jesus was killed. What happened Holy Thursday? There's charcoal fire in the courtyard. Peter comes to warm himself, and people accuse him of being one of Jesus' followers. And 3 times Peter denies that, doesn't he? 3 times Peter denies that. So for Peter, he's looking at that charcoal fire, and there's a great memory coming to him. Guess what? Yeah. So we're going to hear Jesus ask Peter a question right shortly. But in context with that, I want you to look at what John is doing with Peter. If you notice, there's 3 different names used for Peter in this gospel. John begins this part by saying Peter. Peter. Jesus, when he addresses Peter and quoted by John, says Simon. Simon. Simon 3 times. And John, in giving the commentary, says Simon Peter. It's almost as if John has a difficult time even saying the name Simon anymore, because it was Jesus who gave Simon the name Peter, and that we're at the Lake of Tiberias now, if you noticed. What happened there? Remember a couple weeks ago, we were at the headwaters of the Lake of Tiberias. We were at Caesarea Philippi, where the living waters are flowing. And remember, Jesus said he would give living waters for those who come to him. So we're at the headwaters of the Tiberias lake, and it's there that Jesus says, "Thou art Peter, and on this rock I build my church." In other words, Jesus makes an emphatic statement that it's by God's grace that he chooses Peter to be the head of the church. Now, we look at the tempering of that sense of authority. Jesus said, what you bind on earth is bound in heaven. What you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. And still we find something today that tempers authority. And that is in these three questions that Jesus asked Peter. He says, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? And each of these times he says, then feed my sheep, feed my lambs. That he is called to be, as a pastor, he is called to work with kindness, gentleness, mercy. That he is called, much like I think we see Pope Francis doing right now with the letter he put out on families this past week. And if you remember, last fall there was Congress in Pennsylvania for the family. And then the Pope had 2 synods this year and last year in Rome on the family. And he promised that he would be coming out with some directives. Now, those directives were issued this week, and they're not an encyclical, but they are truly a beautiful pastoral guideline in terms of the sacredness, the beauty of family, and how to apply the law on the one hand with the need for mercy on the other. For example, Pope Francis, in talking about families and the news, really thought that maybe the church is getting ready to say, okay, anybody in a second marriage, don't worry about it, just go on and share in communion. That didn't happen. And others were trying to say, well, when the Pope comes out with this, that maybe he's going to give approval to having homosexual marriages. And that did not happen. But what did happen is the Pope saying we must, as pastors, so particularly addressing himself to bishops and priests, we must deal with those who are in irregular situations with a pastoral love. And he used that example of, say, of a family who had gotten a divorce and now they're into a second relationship. And in the second relationship, they have maybe 5 kids and they've been together 25 years. He said it may be a greater sin to break up that marriage than it was to have divorce and begin with. Yeah. And so there's a need to work with people where they are at to help them along the journey to become more what God is calling them to. And that's his goal. That's what he's writing for here. And that's what we see reflected today in Jesus dealing with Peter. Because don't you know that Peter, as he keeps looking at that charcoal fire, and he's answering this question, do you love me, Peter? And he says, of course, I love you. That he is very much aware that he is the worst sinner there is. He denied his Lord 3 times. No one else really has done that. And so with that, we find Jesus now reincorporating Peter, giving him certainly his role of leading, guiding the church as a shepherd. And not to leave it short, but do you notice then, after saying 3 times, Simon Peter, Simon Peter, Simon Peter, John today draws this section to a close by again saying Peter, Peter twice, to basically let us know that yes, Peter has been truly reinstated with the role that Jesus gave him at Caesarea Philippi, to say, thou art Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. What you bind on earth is bound in heaven. What you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. But Peter, don't let it go to your head. You must also work as a pastor in helping others who are also sinners. For remember, Peter, I told you that Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. And when you are made strong, then you must strengthen your brothers. Now you are being made strong. Work with your brothers. Work with your fellow sinners and help all to come to the fullness of life in my kingdom.